We're continuing our study in the Westminster Larger Catechism. We've designated this section the Doctrine of God or Theology Proper. We are still in question number 7. This is part 11, installment number 12. Question number 7 asks, what is God? And the divines wrote in their answer, God is a spirit, in and of himself infinite in being, glory, blessedness, and perfection, all-sufficient, eternal, unchangeable, incomprehensible, everywhere present, almighty, knowing all things, most wise, most holy, most just, most merciful, and gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in goodness and truth. Again, just a note, as we have stated before, the only way that such a definition of God can be adequately given must come from the Holy Scripture, from revelation itself, but in this particular case, it is special revelation. It is where God has revealed beyond the general order of creation the true essence of the being and God, of which hath created all things, and through whom all things were created through his Son for the purpose of glorifying and honoring him, and that he might reveal to us how we are to honor, worship, and glorify him as our God. In the last presentation, we dealt with what the divines described in the attributes of God is the incomprehensibility of God. We now want to take up the attribute of omnipresence, or as the divines have stated, here, everywhere present. When we speak of the presence of God, or that God is everywhere present, we mean that God's presence is always everywhere at all time. It means that there is no place we can escape from where we do not or are not confronted by God himself. But this does not mean certain things, and I will deal with that in a few moments. But for example, in Psalm 139, verses 7 through 11, David asked the question, if there is any place that one can escape from the presence of God. His answer is no. For God's omnipresence is unlimited by space and time. Actually, space and time is not where God dwells in the sense of he comes and occupies space, which we've already talked about, but it is what God has created for man, and time and space are in the thoughts of God. And thus, that is why we cannot escape the presence of God. But listen to what David writes in Psalm 139, beginning at verse 7. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Now, as I stated, omnipresence does not mean that God's being is diffused throughout the universe as if there's a part of him here and there, or that he has come to occupy space itself. His whole being is in every place, and the presence of the Lord is even within every believer, and serves us to always be in confrontation with God. That is to say, we are always being confronted by God. We cannot escape the presence of God. Therefore, omnipresence does not mean that the immediacy of his presence does not vary. It does. God's presence is expressed in such teachings as, for example, God being on his throne, Revelation 4:2. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and I beheld a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. It also speaks of God being in Solomon's temple, 2 Chronicles 7:2. And the priest could not enter the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. Or in the believer, Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Further, God certainly differs in his immediacy, in the sense of his presence, even in the concept of dealing in the lake of fire. As we read, where he refers to the fact that cannot even make your bed in hell without God's presence, listen to how it is expressed in Revelation 14:10. He himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Even in the lake of fire, you cannot escape the presence of God, which I think is probably one of the greatest aspects of condemnation and judgment that a person who does not submit themselves to the Lord in redemption will face through eternity. He will face the fact that he cannot escape from the truth that now in his condemnation is revealed. And thus, knowing the truth, but never being able to come to that truth, and he knows it. And although in the lake of fire, people will be separated from the face presence of God, but not from the Spirit of God. 2 Thessalonians 1:9. These shall be punished, Paul says, with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. Not that he is not there in their present, but they are separated. That's the principle. They are still separated from God. But yet they know the truth of who he is, and they are confronted with his presence. However, those of the lake of fire will never be separated from him who is omnipresent. Again, this Revelation 14:10, he speaks of that very thing, and I'm not going to read it again, but just go back and consider the implications of this. There is obviously no presence of fellowship for those individuals. For the face of God in that sense will be turned from the wicked who are in the lake of fire. But his presence is still there. And the truth and the reality of who he is going to always confront them. Omnipresence, though, also differs from pantheism, and we need to make that distinction. Pantheism identifies the universe with God. The term was first used by the English deist John Toland in 1705, when he taught that God is the mind or the soul of the universe, that is, the material aspect of all that exists. This heresy fails to distinguish the creator from the created, a distinction taught in the very first verse of the Bible. Omnipresent also differs from pantheism, as used by process theologians, wherein they mean that God's presence penetrates the whole of the universe, yet it is not exhausted by the universe. Omnipresence does not mean that God is everywhere present, but only diffused in their teaching throughout and penetrating the universe as it exists. In reality, the teaching of the Bible is simply no one can escape from the presence of God. Why? Because the reality of whether it's life here in time and space, whether it is in the realm of heaven that is also created, because while we say God identifies himself in the realm of heaven, you must remember God is identifying himself as other than all that is created, and heaven itself is a created place. But it is not a dimension like unto time and space. Thus, in eternity, there is also a created dimension and a new heaven and a new earth, which we will study about for a few moments today. But all these things exist as the thoughts of God. In him we move, and in him all things consist. Not in his being, nor does he disperse himself in the material things of the universe. But the reason why we cannot escape the presence of God is, how can you escape the reality of what has brought us into existence when it remains within his thoughts? The answer is, there is no place to hide. There is no time that God does not and is not seeing. And we use that truly in a metaphorical sense. Everything that we do. How does he know the thinking of our mind? How does he know the actions that we put to foot in our life? It is simple. These things not only exist as his thoughts, but they are the decrees of his thoughts. And there is no decree that you can escape from. There is no action or thought you can take that has not been thought by our God and predetermined by him. We don't know them all. He only gives us the revelation of his word by which we are governing our life. And we're to live by that light of that word. But he has told us this great truth. This God we serve is an awesome God. There is nothing like unto him. And one thing for sure, we cannot ever escape his presence.